Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is December 15th, 2025, and tonight's episode is all about the crime of the sons of God, or the Watchers. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of homework on the Watchers and the information about them, and there's a lot of information out there that is non-biblical about the Watchers. In fact, if you start finding books, and I found about 50 of them, that are supposed to talk about the Watchers, but they're not biblical. And they don't follow the Ethiopian canon. They don't follow the King James version of the Bible. Therefore, I can't take them seriously. But I always look for patterns and information, etc. And it really seems like there's a theme that goes on through all of these books that talk about the Watchers. And the theme is real simple. They say in these books that the Watchers are, they got it bad. They're misunderstood. And that's been the whole satanic underlying of all religions that have to do with worshiping the devil. They all say, oh, Satan, he's got it bad, he didn't do anything wrong. He's a humanist and he loves humans. He's just trying to help everybody, apparently, and that's not what Scripture says. So we're going to talk tonight about the sons of God, their crime, and differentiate between, are they guilty of leaving their estate and messing up the entire creation, or are they just misunderstood? Well, we'll get into that. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Texas Militia Official. Texas says, howdy. What's up, Texas? Number two warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion says, commit the crime, you do the time. Yeah, that's correct. Number three warrior is Boots Hafner. Boots saying, hello, Pastor James Carner of the Rebel Airwaves and creator of Elite Potion. Hello to you too. Hello, warriors. Hoping everyone is feeling blessed. To welcome in the new listeners enjoying this topic. Help our host by hitting the thumbs up button. Thank you, Boots, for reminding me. Again, if you don't hit the thumbs up button, Rumble doesn't take us anywhere. And we're slowly climbing, and that's what the Lord told me was going to happen anyway. So, let's not assume this show is going to go anywhere. Because everything that I say is the truth, and the truth just doesn't hit. It doesn't feel good. People don't like that. And that's why I'm never going to be popular. So don't think that this show is going to be like in the millions of viewers. It just won't. And if it does, question me, because I told you guys in the past that anybody with 1 million viewers, they're going to get a knock on the door from Secret Service, because it's a matter of national security, and there are things you can say and things you cannot with such power. Number four warrior is Sheila saying, sup, Buttercups. What is up, Buttercups? All right, guys, let's get into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
Australia announces strict new gun laws. Here's how it can act so swiftly. Well, it's going to act swiftly. Don't they already have a gun law? You can't own a gun in Australia. I didn't know that they were going to announce even more stricter gun laws. Hey, have you guys seen the videos of the shooters that were at Pam Bondi Beach? How bizarre. They were shooting people, and people were just standing there. And they're shooting them with shotguns, and people are just standing there. Yeah. That was so fake. It was so dumb. And one shooter gets caught. The guy takes his gun, and he just kind of walks around afterwards. That's what I saw. So... And the guy who took the shooter's gun he was an immigrant. He had no papers. You see, God does have a sense of humor, and I'm telling you guys, Satan is using this to get rid of guns in all countries so he can continue with his agenda. He cannot do any good, according to the kingdom of hell, unless they stop us from arming up against the government. And that's the only reason why the Second Amendment exists. It doesn't exist so that we can go out and kill things, like deer or bear, or just shoot things up just for fun. Although it is fun. No, it's there so that we can protect ourselves against a government that is being tyrannical. That's really what it's about. But, you can't convince people who look at trauma and cannot understand law, because psychology and law are different things, and they just don't go together, I guess. That's unfortunate. FBI Director Kash Patel, who is definitely blackmailed, I guess he's eager for the spotlight. He casts aside caution in social, I don't know. I have no idea. They won't even let me read it, so screw you, the New York Times. Designated fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction. Apparently, the White House is designating fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction. That's the problem? No, the problem is mental. If you can just, build a place that will work on mental issues and maybe find drugs that can help people through their pain and not get them addicted to addiction pills, well, there's something to be said. But that's not how it works in a fallen world. In a fallen world, no one's going to get along. You don't get along with your neighbors in a fallen world. And that's why Jesus said to love your neighbor, to represent the kingdom of heaven on earth. Love your neighbor. Apparently, Trump sues the BBC for defamation over panorama speech edit. Well, good luck, BBC. You're not going to get anywhere. ACA shoppers face sticker shock as Congress dithers on healthcare. I'm not an expert at Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. I'm not an expert at it. But I do know that there are companies that have made a lot of money off of it. And it's unfortunate that they can't bring something that can offer peace and actual care, that they have to, get their money grubbing hands in it and ruin it for everybody. I don't care about socialism. I don't care about communism. I don't even care about capitalism, because I believe that every ism works great on paper, but once the leaders get in control and the dynasties who control that area or state or country or even the corporations get their little hands in the ism, it's over. And if you really look at history, that's how it's always been. The rich who have what's considered old money will get in, and they will figure out a way. They will figure out a way to take control of the ism. And that's how it always is. 4 defendants arrested for alleged anti-capitalist and anti-government plot to bomb U.S. companies on New Year's Eve. Well, that's not a good idea. Remember, I told you guys, if you really want to change the world, go after the families, the black nobility families and the Illuminati families. There are 13 black nobility families and 13 illuminated families. Go after them. Now, don't bomb them, and you don't need violence, but definitely protest in front of their mansions and tell on your protest little scorecards what they do. They steal, kill, and destroy for Satan. That's how you get them. You don't go after the government because they control the government. You don't go after the corporation because they control the corporation. You don't go after the city or the county or the state. You go after those that control. And I've already broken down for all of you who they are. That's who you go after. Okay? You don't go after, you don't go bomb a building because it's not going to do dick. Okay? It ain't going to do dick. But if you shame those families who have all the money and experiment on every single one of you, if you shame them, then you're getting somewhere. And that's breaking news. All right, when we come back, we're going to be talking about the crime of the Watchers, the sons of God, and what they continue to do to hurt us.
Paying federal income tax is voluntary. So why has every person you know done it their entire lives? You were told it's the law, but the system was built on a lie hidden in plain sight, that you are required by law to pay. The truth is, 98% of Americans don't owe income tax by law. Federal income tax is for federal employees. For everyone else, it's voluntary. You agreed to pay when you signed your first tax return, and you've been renewing that contract every year since. Sounds too good to be true? You're asking, why doesn't everyone know this? Because almost everyone signed before they were old enough to understand it. It's time to unlearn the lie and break free from IRS jurisdictions, protect your assets, and keep more of what you earn legally. Visit unincorporatedisassociations.com now and become tax-free.
All right, we're back. Bufov is here. Robert Gergensen is here. Sheila asks a question. James, did you ever try sermon or look into it for Oliver? Yeah, we did. It's sermons made through pine needles, and yeah, I bought some sermon online. Now I don't know what kind. I don't know sermon, but yeah, we tried it. Did nothing. And I have been using the Rife machine for the past few days, and we're not seeing really much results. I don't know if I need an exorcism or what, but everything I've thrown at this doesn't seem to work. And we're talking about self-injurious behavior from a child who cannot talk. And we don't know how to ask him how he feels. So we're throwing everything at him, and no, nothing has worked so far. I really wish it did. I'm going to continue using the Rife machine, and I don't know if I can report on it because, well, I can't really tell you what's going on because I haven't heard from Matthew Rife and his family ever since I've heard a rumor about the FBI. Something's going on over there. I don't know. But I was able to hook it up to a transmitter, and I was able to, thanks to one of our viewers, able to turn it on and find an application on my phone that I can hook to it. So we're using it, and we will see. I'm going to also use this machine on friends. I've got friends with brain injuries, and I know people who's got cancer. I'm going to start trying it on everybody else. But as far as like Oliver and him stopping the hitting, there was a setting for Asperger's and a setting for autism, and I used them both, and I played it. And, well, we will see. I don't know how long it takes. I don't know if, it needs to be on all the time because I'm not getting any direction from the family that we got the original, I don't know what you call them, just the amplifier, not the amplifier, but the speakers. They're not speakers, but they pulse the hertz sound waves out. It's really cool information, really cool machinery. I just don't know what settings to use for self-injurious behavior. I have no clue because we can't narrow down what Oliver's problem is and why he wants to hurt himself. So we're trying. All right, tonight we're talking about the fallen angels, the crime of the sons of God or the Watchers. Now, guys, there are sins and then there are crimes. Crimes that fracture the order of creation itself. The rebellion of the Watchers was not a misunderstanding, and it was not a moment of passion. It wasn't even a lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate strike against the architecture of heaven. These beings stood in the presence of the Almighty. They understood the laws of their own estate, the nature of their existence, the boundaries of their glory, and yet knowing full well the consequences, they chose to abandon their realm and reach for something that did not belong to them, and that is flesh. Now, angels are spirit by design. Their assignment is celestial. Their form is immaterial. And the boundary between spirit and flesh is not accidental. It is by decree. And to cross it is to vandalize the blueprint of creation. Yet the watchers saw the daughters of men and coveted what was forbidden. They spoke bodies into temporary matter, crafting biological shells not granted by God, but stitched together through forbidden arts. These were not incarnations. They were counterfeits. Garments of flesh woven from dust and desire, made for one purpose, to indulge impulses that heaven had never authored. And when they descended, they did not come as protectors or teachers. They came as thieves. Now, let me take a step back here to make sure you guys understand. I have learned through the Ethiopian canon that the watchers spoke their bodies into existence, just like God spoke creation into existence. They apparently, before they left their estate, had the power to speak matter into form and possess that body for a short period of time to inseminate earthly women. Now, I was always under the impression that it was more genetic modification and CRISPR technology and old ancient technology that the Watchers used to create the giants. But that's not what the Ethiopian canon says. It says they spoke their bodies into existence to, and it said temporarily, because they couldn't hold that existence for long, but temporarily inseminate man, well, not men. They can't inseminate them, it won't do much. But inseminate the women of earth. And according to the canon, it says they found the earth women fair enough to do this. Now, when they descended, they did not come as protectors or teachers. They came as thieves. They took wives they could never truly marry because they couldn't hold their own form. They fathered children that they could never truly raise. They left behind women wounded. Well, giants. Wounded, families shattered, and a world destabilized. And once the deed was done, they withdrew. Kind of like a really bad date. A one-night stand. And they returned to the shadows, abandoning their hybrid offspring to grow into giants, beings of immense stature and unmatched intellect and unrestrained violence. They just couldn't help themselves. These children were born with power, but without place. They were alive, but without destiny. Conscious, but without covenant. They were never meant to exist, yet they dominated the world like kings. This act alone probably didn't make God very happy. But the crimes of the Watchers did not end with just genetics. They whispered to their children from the fringes of reality, instructing them to rule mankind, demand worship, build temples, erect monuments, and reshape civilization in their likeness. They turned their own sin into a global religion, and they convinced humanity that the giants were gods, that the Watchers themselves were divine, that rebellion was enlightenment and corruption was progress. Well, the entire world became a shrine to a counterfeit pantheon. And the Watchers knew exactly where this road led to. They knew they had doomed themselves. They knew their offspring were born condemned, and they knew their sin was unredeemable. Angels have no savior. Giants have no resurrection. And the fathers would be bound in chains. The children would wander the earth as restless spirits. And the final judgment would not be delivered by God alone, but by the saints, you and me, the very humans they sought to corrupt and enslave. This is the part that very few people understand. The jury of their trial is the redeemed. The crime of the Watchers was not simply disobedience. It was the deliberate forging of a world outside God's original design. It was the attempt to merge spirit and flesh without divine permission. It was the creation of a race that would suffer for the sins of their fathers. It was the seduction of humanity into a system of worship built on illegitimate power. And it was the first attempt to exalt themselves above the order God established. What began as lust became rebellion. Rebellion became corruption. Corruption became domination. And domination became a crime so catastrophic that only the flood could erase it entirely. But the story did not even end with the water. Their spirits still wander. Their influence still lingers. Their technology has returned. And their final judgment is approaching. Tonight, we're going to talk about the crime of the Watchers, who left their estate, which was the first forbidden step. Now, the crime of the Watchers did not begin with lust only, okay? It's not like they had a hard-on for the women below them. It began with location. Scripture says they left their first estate, a phrase so brief that most readers pass over it without grasping its enormity. In heaven, estate is more than geography. It is identity, assignment, and its jurisdiction. An angel's estate is the boundary God sets around what they are allowed to be. To leave it is to reject design itself. Before they ever touched a daughter of Adam, the Watchers committed a deeper transgression. They walked away from the place God created them to inhabit, the realm God commanded them to serve, and the nature God endowed them to bear. Now, no one forced them. There was no coercion whatsoever. No deception clouded their minds or judgment. They weren't drunk and they weren't high. Their eyes were wide open and their understanding was perfect. What they left behind was not merely a dwelling, but their entire mode of being. And they knew it. Now, this departure marked the first great fracture between heaven and earth. In leaving their estate, The Watchers stepped into a domain they were never meant to occupy. Angels can appear, minister, communicate, and intervene, but they cannot dwell. They cannot embed themselves into the rhythms of human life. They cannot merge with human culture. They cannot adopt the habits of flesh-bound creatures. Their presence is supposedly to be momentary, not sustained. But the Watchers crossed that line deliberately. They positioned themselves not as messengers, but as residents. They made earth their habitation, altering their relationship to both heaven and humanity. The moment they crossed that boundary, everything that followed became inevitable. Once an angel rejects his or her estate, he loses the protection of obedience and inherits the consequences of self-will. They did not stumble into sin, they architect it. They surveyed earth, identified its vulnerabilities, exploited its curiosities, and targeted its beauty. They stepped into the human world not as guardians, but as predators. The very act of departure set the stage for the corruption that would follow. Because the decision to leave their estate was a decision to abandon the laws that governed their existence. Think of your estate as a place that you own and is yours, and you have the signature of that estate, and that estate is a part of a kingdom, and this area is your estate, and you run that estate, and you are like a lord of that estate. That's what they left. They had perfection at their fingertips. They had the knowledge of knowing they'll live forever in their own estate. But that wasn't enough for them. Something they wanted was beyond their reach. So they constructed something to reach it. Now, their fall, the Watchers, was not like Lucifer's fall, which was a revolt against God's throne. The Watchers were different. This is something that is a mystery that we haven't been able to talk about because I haven't really done a show on it. But what is the difference between Satan and the Watchers? And we'll get into that. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe. But the Watchers' fall was actually quieter than what Satan did, and it was more intimate. A rebellion expressed not in cosmic war, but in relational betrayal. They chose earth over heaven. They chose desire over duty. And they actually chose flesh over their own spirit. They chose a world not made for them. And by choosing it, they began to unmake it. Every sin of Genesis 6 flows from this very act. The first act, by leaving their estate, broke the boundary between realms, tore open a forbidden doorway, and invited consequences that would echo through every generation to come. The Watchers were not cast down in ignorance. They descended with intention. They came as beings who understood the laws that they were breaking. And they came knowing that once they stepped out of their assigned estate, they were no longer angels of God. They were fugitives in creation. Now, once the Watchers left their estate, which I wouldn't have done it, but they faced a problem that no angel had ever encountered. They were spirits attempting to participate in a world of flesh. Now, angels are not biological beings. They have no DNA, no reproductive organs, no chemical systems, no biological cycles. Fallen angels, their nature is entirely spiritual, and their glory operates outside the constraints of physical form. But the Watchers were not not content to influence humanity from a distance. They desired participation. They desired embodiment. They desired sensation. And sensation required flesh. But because God did not grant angels bodies, the Watchers had to manufacture their own. And this act, rarely preached about, barely understood, and yet central to the entire Genesis 6 narrative, was the moment that they crossed from rebellion into creation theft. What they forged was not true incarnation, because incarnation requires divine permission and divine seed, both of which were reserved for the Messiah. What they created were biological interfaces, or temporary garments of flesh woven through forbidden knowledge. Early texts describe these forms as garments, shells, and bodies of mortal imitation. That's what it says in the Ethiopian canon. Flesh-like enough to perform human acts, yet spiritually hollow, animated only by the presence of a being who did not belong inside them. Now, the Watchers used the mysteries they once guarded to counterfeit the works of God. Metallurgy, chemistry, root extraction, enchantments, these were never intended to be used for corruptive purposes. But the Watchers twisted these sciences into a means of embodiment. They took the dust of the earth, just as God did when forming man, Adam, but without his breath, without his intention, and without his sanctifying word. And what resulted were bodies without souls, flesh without spirit, vessels designed for pleasure rather than purpose. And their form was just temporary, very unstable, and grotesquely functional. Again, a violation of both heaven and earth. This explains how beings of pure spirit were able to engage physically with human women. They did not become men, they put on bodies. They did not inhabit flesh, they animated constructs. They wore matter like clothing, garments tailored from dust and desire. And every moment they occupied these forms, they further corrupted the created order. And every time they took a wife, the boundary between realms trembled. Now, it's not like they came together one day, made the oath, committed, and then they all went down that one day and had sex with 200 women. They continued to go down and put on another garment and make more, and continued to do this over and over and over, using counterfeit bodies, which served one purpose: the expression of a forbidden union. To boink. Now, when Scripture says they took wives, it does not mean they married them in covenant. It means they had sex with them. In fact, Scripture says if you have sex with a person, you married them. So how many people have you married, Boots, Sheila, Robert, Boofob. I married many. God forgive me. When Scripture says they took wives, it does not mean that they married them in covenant. It just means they seized them for breeding, a biological act performed for the sole purpose of producing a hybrid line. I didn't believe this until we got into the Ethiopian canon, which is where we're getting all of the truths. And the Watchers were not seeking companionship either. They did not want to cuddle after. And no, nobody made them a sandwich. They were seeking offspring only. And offspring required a fusion of their spiritual nature with the physical nature of humanity. Now, this moment when spirit merged with manufactured flesh to corrupt human bloodlines was the greatest biological crime in the history of creation. This was not just lust alone. This was reproduction used as rebellion. This was incarnation imitated in mockery of the one who would one day become flesh legitimately, Jesus Christ. And once the act was complete, once the seed was planted, the Watchers abandoned their artificial forms as easily as stepping out of a cloak, returning to the spiritual realm to whisper in secret to the children that they left behind. Gen 6:20 says transubstantiation. Transubstantiation. Yeah, I think that's the right word. Now, the forging of these bodies was not merely sin, it was blasphemy against the image of God. It was a counterfeit of the miracle reserved for Jesus Christ. It was the Watchers' attempt to create their own lineage, their own story, their own dominion, and it is the reason that the world before the flood became unrecognizable. Because the moment angels touched flesh, flesh itself began to unravel. Boot says, hold on, I'm taking my boots off to keep counting. He got past 10. He's got to count with his toes. Boots, you sinner. Now, from the moment the Watchers' counterfeit bodies touched the women of earth, a new race began to form. One that heaven had never authorized and humanity had no defense against. These children were not merely large or strong, they were ontologically violations. Hybrids birthed from a union that creation itself could not accommodate. They inherited physicality from their mothers, but their father's nature did not translate cleanly into flesh. When a human receives breath from God, the Nephilim received animation without ancestry, consciousness without registry, vitality without a place in the divine order. Now, they were alive, but not in the way Adam's children were alive. They moved in thought and conquered, but they did so with no tether to heaven and no lineage that heaven recognized. Their bodies were immense, and their minds very sharp, and their appetites were insatiable. Early records describe them as giants in stature, but even more as giants in influence. They were builders of cities, founders of cults, inventors of forbidden technologies. They possessed strength beyond that of men, intellect that rivaled the sages, and charisma powerful enough to reshape civilizations. But behind their power was a terrible absence. They were beings with consciousness but no covenant, emotion but no redemption, purpose but no promise. They were born with authority but denied inheritance. Everything in them was amplified except the one thing that matters most: a soul breathed by God. Scorpion. They're just angels that wanted earthly tea, pussy. I feel bad about doing that, but I don't. Forgive me, Lord. Now, their identity, which they lacked moral direction, peace. In fact, this deficit defined their own nature because they were not born into the registry of life. They could not find rest or peace or even a moral direction because they had no real father. They had no Holy Ghost. They had no Jesus. And their identity was fractured from birth, and that fracture widened as they grew. They had no internal boundary to restrain their impulses either. They had no divine breath to regulate their passions, no spiritual inheritance to moderate their appetites. Violence became their language, domination their instinct, and worship their demand. They consumed resources faster than the earth could supply them. That's a big problem, because even the Bible says that they ran out of food, so they turned to men and ate them instead. They devoured animals, then men, then each other. Their hunger was bottomless because it was never physical to begin with. It was the hunger of beings born without spiritual fullness. In a way, you could just say they were assholes. The world admired and feared them. Their achievements were extraordinary, their architecture unmatched, their mysteries intoxicating. But their presence destabilized the earth. Whenever they ruled, blood followed. Their kingdoms rose quickly and fell violently. They became the gods of the ancient world, the Hercules and Titans and the heroes and monsters preserved in fragmented mythology. The Watchers had created a line of kings without thrones, priests without a priesthood, and beings who could command armies but could not command their own nature. This is the tragedy behind their might. They were made for exaltation, but doomed to annihilation. They were fathered by rebels and birthed through corruption. They were powerful enough to dominate the world, but powerless to escape their own fate. The flood was not the only judgment upon wicked humanity. It was an act of mercy toward the Nephilim themselves, who lived in torment, endlessly driven by impulses they could not understand and consequences they could not avoid. Their fathers abandoned them, creation rejected them, and heaven could not claim them. They were giants on earth, but orphans in eternity. And when they died, their bodies returned to dust, but their spirits remained trapped between realms. Neither angel nor human, neither living nor dead. These were the spirits that became the demons that Jesus Christ confronted, the unclean forces seeking embodiment, the restless minds forever searching for a body that would fit. The birth of the giants marked the beginning of the world's unraveling, and their death marked the beginning of a spiritual infestation that continues to this day. In the children of the Watchers, we see power without purpose, identity without belonging, and existence without a home. They were the first victims of their father's crime and the first instruments of their father's ongoing rebellion. You can blame the fallen angels for doing this, because you know what? They created children and they're completely damned. There is nothing anybody can do about it either, not even God himself. All of the demons will go to the lake of fire. They don't belong on earth or in heaven. And hell, it's going to be empty after judgment. Maybe filled in with concrete. But it's a tragedy because if you really think about it, I feel awful for the Nephilim who were born without an estate, without an inheritance, without a moral compass, and without even one chance at redemption. All because of a group of angels who said, who cares? Probably one of the most selfish thing that's ever been done. And those fathers, they fled and let their children left to rule, while they whispered in their ears and made their children worship them as God, and started all kinds of different religions. Now, once the Watchers succeeded in producing offspring, their counterfeit bodies no longer served a purpose. The act was complete. The seed was planted. The biological interface that they had woven out of dust and forbidden knowledge could be now discarded. And so they did what corrupt fathers always do. They left. What? They didn't even hold their babies. They shed their temporary flesh as easily as a man removes clothing, stepping back into the unseen realm, while their children remained in the visible world, confused, powerful, and utterly alone. This abandonment is one of the darkest threads in the entire Genesis 6 narrative. The Watchers desired children, but never intended to raise them. Assholes. They wanted a lineage, but not the labor of fatherhood. They engineered giants not for nurture or legacy, but for domination and vicarious glory. Dicks. The moment the giants began to grow, the Watchers retreated beyond mortal sight, retreating to the borders of heaven and earth, where they could whisper but not intervene openly. Their crime was not simply that they created life unlawfully, but that they created life they had no intention of loving. Their act was closer to biological experimentation than parenthood, and the world became their laboratory. The Nephilim grew up without any guidance. There was no moral instruction, no covenantal foundation, no spiritual orientation. Their mothers could not teach them, for nothing in humanity's tradition prepared a woman to raise a giant whose mind moved faster than hers, whose body outgrew the home within months, and whose impulses were shaped by a spiritual lineage she could not comprehend. Their fathers did not walk with them, did not speak with them, or even nurture them. Yet our Father walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening every single day. Goes to show that they had no love in their heart for their own kids. Their fathers didn't speak with them, they didn't nurture them, and instead they whispered from the periphery, teaching their children not righteousness, but sorcery, witchcraft, domination, casting spells, ritualistic killing and murder. Domination, astrology, warfare, and the pursuit of worship. This was not mentorship, it was indoctrination. The abandonment shaped the giants into tyrants. Without a place in creation, they made a place by force. Without an inheritance from God, they manufactured their own kingdoms on earth. Without belonging in the divine order, they redefined order around themselves. They ruled through fear, built cities around their appetites, demanded offerings of grain and blood, and constructed monuments designed to outlast the heavens. The world became a patchwork of giant-ruled enclaves, each one its own experiment in corrupted kingship. Humanity followed them not because they were righteous, but because they were irresistible. They were taller, stronger, smarter, and seemingly immortal. And all the while, their fathers watched from the shadows, basking in their children's stolen glory. They didn't even pay child support. The Watchers taught them how to harness metals, how to mix potions, how to read the stars, how to manipulate energies. And they revealed secrets heaven had kept veiled for a reason, turning knowledge that was once holy into tools for oppression. The giants became the earthly extension of their father's rebellion, the physical manifestation of a spiritual crime. And through them, the Watchers found a way to rule the world indirectly, avoiding the direct wrath of God while still influencing the course of human civilization. Yet for all their power, the giants carried the wound of abandonment. They were kings who never knew love, rulers who never knew rest, conquerors who never knew peace. Yet their hunger for worship was a symptom of their spiritual homelessness. Their violence was a language of beings who never received guidance. Their madness was the echo of their father's betrayal. And the Watchers' abandonment created creatures too mighty for humanity and too broken for heaven. And in their loneliness, they turned their kingdoms into prisons, their temples into graves, and their legacies into cautionary tales. And when God looked upon the earth and saw violence filled in every corner, he did not simply judge humanity, he judged a world raised by absent fathers. The flood was the verdict upon the Watchers' abdication of responsibility. Their children drowned because their fathers fled. The giants fell because their creators refused to stand with them. Pussies. And after the waters receded, the Watchers found themselves imprisoned, not just for what they had done, but for what they had refused to do, to take care of their own kids. The abandonment of the giants was the second layer of a crime of the Watchers. Their first betrayal was against heaven, and their second was against their own children. Kind of makes you see things in a whole different light, doesn't it? Well, thanks to the Ethiopian canon, we can learn this stuff now. The Watchers turned their own children into idols, taught them how to be wizards and warlocks, but never nurtured them, never patted them on the back. They didn't even show up at their kids' graduation. Talk about losers. With their hybrid offspring abandoned on earth and growing into beings of immense size and terrifying intellect, meaning they were very smart, the Watchers shifted from physical corruption to spiritual conquest. They could no longer occupy the counterfeit bodies that they had fashioned, but they could still wield influence. And so they retreated into the unseen realm, not as repentant rebels, but as architects of a new religious order. Their goal was simple: to maintain control through worship. If they could not rule the world through incarnation, they would rule it through illusion. Their children, the Nephilim, became the perfect instruments for this deception. And from the edges of visibility, the watchers whispered into the minds of their own sons, meaning because they were sort of related, they were sort of. When the watchers whispered in their ear, they could hear them. They taught them how to command men, how to manipulate fear, how to channel spiritual energies, and how to position themselves as living embodiments of divine power. Sounds like today's military-industrial complex. They instructed them in the arts of domination, temple building, ritual sacrifice, astronomical alignment, and the crafting of statues and idols. Now, the giants did not invent religion. They just inherited it from their fathers, who were losers. The corruption of worship began not with mankind, but with the watchers weaponizing the spiritual hunger that God placed inside humanity. Civilizations rose around these hybrid kings. They became the mighty men of old, men of renown, which means smart. Men who were really smart. Men of old, meaning they were wise and smart. The heroes of gods and ancient myth. And their stories were preserved in culture spanning the earth because the watchers ensured they would be remembered as divine figures. They wanted humanity to associate strength with godhood, height with holiness, and power with legitimacy. Through the giants, the watchers built their first counterfeit priesthood. Humanity began to bring offerings, build altars, and dedicate cities to these towering rulers. The world's first religions were not atheistic or secular. They were deeply spiritual. But their spirituality was bent around beings who had no right or rightful claim to worship at all. The watchers fed their children a steady stream of lies. Way to go, Dad. That they were born to rule. They were divine by nature. That the world was theirs by inheritance. And that humanity existed to serve them. Well, this indoctrination transformed the Nephilim from abandoned sons into tyrant gods. And their temples were not expressions of devotion. They were tools for siphoning spiritual loyalty away from the Creator. The watchers wanted worship because worship is power. And in heaven, worship is an act of truth. On earth, corrupted worship becomes a channel of influence, strengthening the rebellion and tightening its grip on human culture. As the giants consolidated their power, the watchers introduced forbidden knowledge to humanity, not for mankind's benefit, but to accelerate the corruption. Astrology became a counterfeit form of divine guidance. Sorcery became a counterfeit form of healing. Metallurgy became a counterfeit form of protection. And cosmetics and seduction became counterfeit forms of beauty and covenant. The watchers turned every holy instinct into a corrupted reflection of what God intended. Through their teachings, they built a world where the giants ruled not only by physical force, but by spiritual influence. intellectual superiority, and technological advantage. These false gods became the central pillars of ancient civilizations. And we're talking about Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Egypt, Canaan, and the pre-flood empires long erased by time, but remembered in myth. Nimrod, Hercules, Gilgamesh, Osiris, and the Titans are all echoes of these early hybrid kings. Their legends endure because the Watchers engraved their stories into the memory of humanity, ensuring that even after the flood, fragments of their glory would linger. Their presence became the blueprint for every later empire that would rise in defiance of God. But despite their appetite, despite their apparent divinity, the giants were still fractured beings. They were children with no souls, kings with no covenant, divine pretenders propped up by the whispers of fathers who could not show themselves. Deadbeat dads. The Watchers used them as idols, as proxies, as avatars of rebellion. And the giants, desperate for identity and purpose, embraced the lies wholeheartedly. They believed they were gods, yet they were never more than orphans shaped into tyrants. The rise of the false gods was not humanity's idea. It was the Watchers' strategy. Their crime was not only the corruption of flesh, it was the corruption of worship. Through their children, they rewrote the spiritual map of the ancient world, replacing the Creator with creatures, truth with deception, and covenant with empire. It was not enough for the Watchers to break heaven's law. They aimed to rewrite heaven's memory on earth. And in doing so, they ensured that their judgment would not only be for what they did with their bodies, but for what they did with the souls of men. And by the time the giants reached the height of their power, the world no longer resembled the one that God created in the first place. Every city bore the mark of their rule. Every society echoed their teachings. Every corner of civilization was infused with technologies, rituals, and ideologies that originated not from the breath of God, but from the whispers of the Watchers. Humanity lived in the shadow of hybrid kings whose authority had no heavenly sanction and whose wisdom carried the poison of rebellion. The earth groaned under the weight of a corruption that it could not sustain. And violence filled the land, not because humans were inherently monstrous, but because monstrous beings had become humanity's teachers. Scripture says that all flesh had corrupted its way, a phrase often misunderstood. I even misunderstood it. I misunderstood it as genetically modified. It does not simply describe moral failure. It describes biological collapse. The genetic integrity of creation was actually unraveling due to this anomaly that was created. And the boundaries between species were blurring. The purity of Adam's line was under threat. The Watchers' crime was no longer isolated to their union with women. It was rewriting the blueprint of life itself. Thus, the earth was becoming a hybrid world, a world in which God's image was being overwritten by a counterfeit. Without intervention, humanity would lose the very identity that God breathed into Adam. The giants were not just tyrants, they were a contagion. God's decree of the flood was not rash, nor was it cruel. It was surgical. It was precise. It was the only means of cutting away a corruption that threatened the continuation of humanity. Noah was chosen not merely for moral integrity, because he was a drunk, but because he was the perfect in his generations, a phrase that refers to the uncorrupted lineage preserved in his bloodline. He was a living witness that Adam's line had not been fully extinguished just yet. Noah presented the continuity of the image of God, and without his preservation, humanity would have become something other than what God intended, something unredeemable, something incompatible with salvation history. The flood was the verdict upon the world that the Watchers had engineered. It was the dismantling of their empire, the erasure of their experiments, the undoing of their counterfeit creation. The waters did not simply drown bodies. They drowned ideas, technologies, and cultures built solely on rebellion. The temples of the giants collapsed beneath the waves. Their cities disappeared into sediment. Their names were reduced to myth. And the world that emerged from the ark was not merely a cleaner version of the old world. It was a different world entirely, one stripped of the visible presence of the Watchers and the physical dominance of their sons. But judgment works in layers. The flood destroyed the giants' bodies, but their spirits remained. The Watchers had created a race without souls, and because their spirits did not originate from God's breath, they had no destination in His order. They could not ascend to heaven, for heaven had not authored them. They could not descend to Sheol, for Sheol had no place for beings that were not part of Adam's race. Instead, they remained trapped between realms, restless, disembodied, and embittered. These wandering spirits became the demons that Jesus confronted, the unclean forces that seek embodiment, because they were born of bodies and died without them. The Watchers themselves received a different judgment. They were bound in chains beneath the earth, awaiting the day when the saints, the very humans that they corrupted, would sit as jury over their rebellion. And their fall was not instantaneous. It was the culmination of a sequence of crimes that reshaped the earth. Their imprisonment was not arbitrary. It was the necessary containment of beings whose freedom had nearly annihilated creation. The flood did not end the crime of the Watchers. It reset the stage for its second act. The spirits of their children remained to haunt humanity. The influence of their teachings lingered in post-flood cultures. The memory of their power survived in myth. And the rebellion that began with the counterfeit incarnation continues today in the technological ambitions of a world once again seeking to merge spirit and flesh without God's permission. Well, the flood was judgment. It wasn't just judgment and mercy. It was destruction and preservation. It was a closing of the cosmic chapter and the quiet preparation for the next one. And in the ruined world left behind, the consequences of the Watchers' crime still pulse beneath the surface, waiting for their final reckoning. And when the flood swept away the hybrid empires of the ancient world, it ended the physical presence of the giants, but it did not end their existence, as their bodies returned to dust, but their spirits, unlike human spirits, had nowhere to go. They were not born of God's breath, so they could not return to Him. They were not part of Adam's lineage, so Sheol could not receive them. They were not angels, so heaven had no chamber for them. They were not human, so no resurrection awaited them. They were anomalies, living consciousness without metaphysical citizenship. And their existence was a wound in creation, a tear in the fabric of being that could not be mended by death alone. Thus, the second crime of the Watchers emerged. They created billions of spirits with no place to belong. The Ethiopian and Enochian traditions describe these spirits as restless, wandering the dry places, seeking bodies because their entire existence was born from embodiment. They thirst for flesh, not out of malice alone, but because embodiment is the only condition they have ever known. To be disembodied is agony for them, not torment inflicted by God, but the result of an identity without anchor. So they're trapped between realms, conscious but unrooted, intelligent but unfinished. And their hunger is metaphysical, and it is endless. This explains why demons behave as they do. Possession is not merely an act of hostility, it's survival. They enter human bodies because the human nervous system provides the structure their fractured minds desperately seek. They merge with human thoughts because they have none of their own that can hold shape. They cling to personalities because they do not possess stable identities. The violence, chaos, and madness they bring is not merely evil, it is the symptom of beings that were never supposed to exist in the first place. So they echo the instability of their own birth, born from rebellion, formed without divine order, and shaped by fathers who abandoned them. And yet, even in this tragic condition, the Watchers exploited their children even further. From the shadows of their imprisonment, they influenced the spirits of the Nephilim, directing them towards humanity as weapons of corruption. They whispered purpose into their wandering minds, telling them that mankind was their prey, their host, and their inheritance. They conditioned these disembodied spirits to manipulate dreams, torment souls, inspire idols, and reconstitute ancient systems of worship. In essence, the Watchers turned their own children into instruments of psychological and spiritual warfare. The giants, once tyrants in flesh, became tyrants in spirit. This is why the gospel portrays Jesus' encounters with demons as confrontations with beings who recognize him instantly. They know him because he is the judge that they dread, the one whose authority defines their eventual erasure. And their cries, quote, "Have you come to torment us before the time," unquote, are the admissions of spirits who understand their impeding dissolution. The Watchers taught them rebellion, but Jesus unveils their futility. They are the remnants of a ruined line, the spiritual debris of a crime that heaven will not permit to continue forever. Thus, their presence in the world after the flood ensured that the influence of the Watchers would continue even after their imprisonment. Humanity still faced whispers, temptations, false visions, and corrupting ideas. The second crime of the Watchers was not the creation of a hybrid race, it was the unleashing of a spiritual infestation that would plague every generation to come. The demons became the unseen architects behind pagan worship, the animators behind idols, the whisperers behind kings who sought divine power outside the covenant. And they kept the memory of the pre-flood rebellion alive and taught humanity to repeat it in new forms. And here lies the darkest irony. The Watchers created children to extend their power, but those children became the evidence against them. Their restlessness is testimony. Their torment is testimony. Their possession of human bodies is testimony. Their very existence is the indictment that will one day condemn their fathers. The spirits that roam are the spiritual footprints of the Watchers' rebellion, a wandering court record of a cosmic crime that has not yet reached its final judgment. And in the disembodied giants, we see the residue of the pre-flood world, the shadow of a rebellion that reshaped creation, and the ongoing consequence of an act that neither heaven nor earth was willing to absorb. Their existence was the second great harm that the Watchers inflicted upon the world, a harm that continues to haunt humanity until the final day when both fathers and children face the verdict of the saints. We are going to judge them in the final verdict. It'll be up to us if they go to the lake of fire or they get given a second chance. Isn't that interesting? After the flood, the Watchers were imprisoned, and their hybrid children became disembodied wanderers. But the rebellion did not end. It simply changed form. Stripped of bodies and bound in darkness, the Watchers adapted. If they could no longer enter the physical world directly, they could shape it indirectly. If they could not incarnate, they would inspire others to build vessels for them. And if they could not rule openly through giant kings, they would rule through invisible systems, through ideas, technologies, religions, and empires. This is the phrase of the crime of the Watchers that humanity still lives under today. The phase. And in the world that emerged from the flood, the Watchers reorganized their strategy around influence rather than incarnation. They whispered to the spirits of their dead children, teaching them to plague humanity with false visions and counterfeit revelations. They whispered to men like Nimrod, who sought to rebuild Babel as a new attempt to pierce the heavens and restore the pre-flood union of realms. They whispered to priests, shamans, and monarchs, guiding them to resurrect the rituals, technologies, and cosmic architectures of the old world. The Watchers' influence shifted from biological corruption to cultural engineering. Thus, humanity became the new builders of their rebellion. Again. And what the Watchers once forged with their own hands, metallurgy, sorcery, energy manipulation, well, humans now rediscovered under spiritual supervision. The forbidden arts resurfaced in every ancient civilization. Egypt with its necromancy, Babylon with its astrology, Greece with its hybrid gods, Canaan with its blood rituals. These practices were not independent developments. They were the Watchers' fingerprints resurfacing in the human imagination as their crime echoed through millennia, shaping societies that did not remember their origin but preserved their essence. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim served as agents of this reconstruction. They infiltrated human minds through possession, dreams, and inspiration. They impersonated gods, ancestors, and celestial beings. They appeared in visions and demanded temples. Humans erected ziggurats, pyramids, stone circles, and ritual sites precisely where these spirits guided them. And every altar to a false god was an extension of the Watchers' ambition. The reestablishment of worship structures that fed their rebellion. But the most dangerous development came much later when humanity advanced far enough to build what the Watchers always needed: technology. The modern world has unknowingly become the second Babel. Artificial intelligence, robotics, genetic modification, cloning, neural interfaces, these are all technologies designed to bridge the divide between spirit and flesh. Human scientists, believing themselves pioneers, are unknowingly walking the path once carved by the Watchers. They are reconstructing the forbidden body, synthetic vessels, enhanced embryos, transhuman hybrids, and machine consciousness. The fallen angels cannot incarnate, but humanity is building incarnations for them. The Watchers have no need to reforge their own bodies now. They simply need mankind to finish their work. Every technological breakthrough brings us closer to the recreation of the pre-flood interface, the engineered flesh that allows spiritual beings to inhabit material form. And what the Watchers once achieved through forbidden knowledge, we are now achieving through scientific ambition. The same crime, just repackaged as innovation. A world once ruled by giants is now poised to be ruled by images. Beings made in the form of the beast, but not born, but constructed. Revelation's prophecy that the image is given breath is not symbolic language. It is the final step of the Watchers' agenda. An image, an artificial body, receives spirit, receives consciousness, receives occupancy. The crime that began with angels taking flesh will end with flesh being redesigned for angels. The Watchers' long game was never about the past either. It was always about the future. Their goal was not merely to corrupt the world before the flood, but to position humanity to rebuild their rebellion with greater precision and global reach. By turning men into builders of the forbidden, they ensured that their influence would outlive their imprisonment. Their crimes became civilization's blueprint, and their rebellion became humanity's progress. And their children became the whispering architects behind every empire determined to cross the boundary between heaven and earth. The pre-flood world fell by water. The post-flood world will face judgment by fire. Not because God is cruel, but because humanity, guided by ancient rebels, is accelerating the same crime once again. The crime of the Watchers did not conclude with the flood, nor did their imprisonment end their story altogether. Their final reckoning was not placed into the hands of archangels or heavenly thrones. Instead, decreed something far more shocking, something almost unthinkable in the cosmic order. Human beings will judge the angels. That is a literal courtroom structure of the final age. And understanding why reveals the deepest layer of their crime. The Watchers rebelled not against abstract law, but against humanity itself. They invaded the human domain, corrupted human flesh, manipulated human worship, enslaved human civilizations, and reshaped human destiny. Their crime was fundamentally relational, an assault on the very creatures destined to inherit the kingdom of God. When Paul says, "Do you not know we shall judge angels?" he is referring to the ancient teaching preserved in the Ethiopian and Second Temple traditions. Those who were corrupted by the Watchers' rebellion will one day stand as witnesses and verdict givers against them, which we've been talking about on my show many, many times. The ones they tried to destroy will become their judges. And this is why the Watchers hate humanity with a depth unmatched even by demons. It's not because humans possess the divine breath that they themselves lack. It is because God appointed mankind as the tribunal before whom they must bow to. Angels are older, stronger, wiser, and more powerful, but they forfeited their authority when they violated the human realm. The courtroom of the end does not restore their rank, it reverses it. The redeemed will sit on thrones, and the Watchers will stand as defendants. This is the divine justice as its most poetic. The victims become the jury, and the weak become the judges, and the oppressed become the arbiters of eternity. Thus, this assignment explains why the Watchers tried so desperately to corrupt the human line. If Adam's lineage could be compromised, if humanity could be blended into hybrid flesh, if the image of God could be distorted beyond recognition, then no pure judges would remain. No human tribunal could be assembled. The entire system of divine justice hinged on the preservation of humanity as God created it. And this is why Noah's uncorrupted bloodline mattered. Because it was not only about preserving the Messiah's genealogy, it was about preserving the jury. Every saint who overcomes, every believer washed in the Lamb's blood, every human restored to the image of Christ becomes a future member of that divine court. The eldership of heaven is not populated by angels, but by the resurrected humans. The 24 elders surrounding God's throne are not seraphim. They are redeemed men. The kingdom Christ announced is not an angelic kingdom, it is a human one. And the judgment of the Watchers belongs to the heirs of Adam, not the hosts of heaven. And make no mistake, the Watchers know this. Their rage is fueled by the knowledge that their fate lies in the hands of those who they once manipulated, deceived, and tried to erase. As every temptation they whisper, every false doctrine they inspire, every technological scheme they influence has a single overreaching purpose: to corrupt the future judges. Now, if humanity can be morally broken, spiritually deceived, or biologically altered, then the legitimacy of the final court is threatened. Their entire rebellion hinges on disqualifying the jury that God appointed. And this is why the saints are targeted more fiercely than any other group on earth. The Watchers understand that the blood of Christ restores what they tried to destroy, and it reestablishes the image, reinstates the authority, and enthrones the believer as a future judge. Every redeemed human being becomes a living reminder that the Watchers' downfall is approaching. Every spiritual victory, every act of obedience, every moment of repentance strengthens the court that will one day pronounce their sentence. And that's their final humiliation. The knowledge that they're children of dust, that we are, and the ones that they viewed as inferior, the ones that they sought to corrupt, the ones they abandoned to suffering, will be the ones who judge them. And that will be the final reckoning, when their crimes meet the fire. And for the angels, it's unthinkable. As they were created immortal, they were fashioned for eternal service. They stood in the presence of God's radiance and spoke with voices that shaped the movement of the stars. Yet the crime of the watchers made them candidates for something no angel was ever meant to experience: erasure. And when the sentence is carried out, it's the final way. It is final in a way even death has never been. The lake of fire does not burn forever. It ends forever, meaning they're just going to be ended. And in that final moment, when the rebels are no more and peace fills the universe again, the saints will understand the full weight of the honor that was given to them, that they stood as witnesses against the crime that nearly unmade creation. And through their judgment, our judgment towards the angels, the world was set right. So the story of the Watchers is not merely an ancient tale tucked between the lines of Genesis and the memory of civilizations long turned to dust. It is the foundational rebellion that shaped the world before the flood, that warped the spiritual architecture of humanity and continues to reverberate through history. Their crime was layered, leaving their estate, forging counterfeit bodies, corrupting human flesh, birthing beings who never belonged, and abandoning their own children to madness, teaching humanity forbidden arts, redirecting worship towards themselves, and planting a legacy of deception that still guides modern empires today. It was a rebellion that crossed every boundary that God established, not only in spirit, but in genetics, authority, worship, and destiny. And the giants they created were powerful but rootless, brilliant but broken, conquerors who were themselves victims. And when the final sentence is carried out, the lake of fire does not become an eternal torture chamber of cosmic eraser, a place where rebellion ends and where beings who never belonged to the order of the creation finally cease, where the spiritual pollution they spread is removed forever. The new creation does not carry their memory. Their story ends not in smoke, but in silence. The crime of the Watchers is the tale of a rebellion that attempted to unmake the world and of a God who refused to let creation be rewritten. It is the tale of angels who lusted after flesh, of giants who ruled without identity, of demons who wander without rest, and of the saints who will one day render the final verdict. It is a story of cosmic tragedy and divine justice, of corruption unleashed and restoration promised. Above all, it is a story that reminds us of why the flood came in the first place, why Jesus had to come, and why the resurrection matters, and why the saints must rise. The rebellion began with angels exalting themselves above humanity. Well, it ends with humanity enthroned above angels. So the crime was theirs, but the victory is ours.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.